All right, guys, so now we understand the opioid piece. Let's think about what it means to be an epidemic. And to do that, let's just start with the definition of an epidemic. So you can see here on this slide that Webster's dictionary defines epidemic as affecting a disproportionately large number of individuals within a population, being excessively prevalent, or characterized by very widespread growth or extent. You have to excuse my underlining. Not perfect at that. Okay, so disproportionately large number of individuals within a population, excessively prevalent, very widespread growth. Now let's look at what's happening in the United States right now and see if we fit into this category. First, we can see excessively prevalent. Over 259 million opioid prescriptions were written in the year 2012. That's significant because that's enough for every adult in the United States to have their own prescription of opioids. Additionally, we know that the opioid prescription rate has increased over 300% since the year 1999. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. First, think back between 1999 and the year 2010. Did anything happen in the United States that would cause us to have 300 times more pain than we were having? I can't really think of anything. So that's an important thought process right there to start to process in your head. Additionally, it's important to note that with this 300% increase in the amount of opioids we were giving people, our patients' pain did not decrease at all. Zero. None. However, we did see an increase in overdose deaths within this time of 165,000 people. It's an interesting thought. It seems a little prevalent to me. However, out of all of this that we talk about, this slide is the most telling slide that I ever show people, in my opinion. What we're looking at here is the amount of hydrocodone produced in the entire world. And you know, hydrocodone, that's Lortab, Norcos, that type of thing. So we look right here down here at this bottom number, and in the year 1999, worldwide production of hydrocodone was 3 tons. Then we look here at this number by the year 2010, so 10 years later roughly, and we see 42 tons of hydrocodone were produced across the world. 42 tons in the entire world. The most telling part of this slide, however, happens right here, and that 99% of that 42 tons was for use in the United States of America. A disproportionately large number of individuals within a population. All right, so when we look at this chart, we're going to look at the widespread piece of it. And we're going to look at 2 different things on this chart. One, the number of opioid overdose deaths, and 2, the number of prescriptions written per state for opioids. We know there is a direct correlation between a written prescription for opioids and misuse and abuse and death and change into heroin and then to fentanyl. So we know that there's a direct correlation between this information, and you'll see that more so in the next presentation than in this one, because right now we're just trying to establish it's an epidemic. That's why it's significant, however, to understand how many prescriptions are written per person in your state. And as we look at this chart, we see that the 3 states that are in the dark maroon, all 3 bordering Mississippi, are the ones with the highest number of prescriptions per person. So they write more than 107 prescriptions per 100 people, which just means there's more than 1 prescription per every person. Now we're not talking adults anymore. It's every man, woman, child, infant in the state, okay? Now, Mississippi's not in the dark burgundy. However, it is important to note that since we started paying attention to this, roughly 2010, 2012, Mississippi has been 4th or 5th on this list since that time. Right now in 2016, Mississippi wrote 105.6 prescriptions for every 100 people in the state of Mississippi. That's more than enough for everybody to have one plus some. Give one to your baby and give one to your kid too. That's a lot of prescriptions circulating in the state of Mississippi. That's pretty widespread. Now let's talk about these stars for just a minute to again illustrate the significance of that. The stars indicate states that have reported a significant increase in the number of opioid overdose deaths. And so you can see a lot of them are occurring in red states or in burgundy states. What's interesting is you see states like Mississippi and Alabama and even Arkansas that don't report significantly high overdose deaths, but do have significantly high prescription rates. Why do you think that is? Why do you think states, southern states like Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama may not report a higher number of overdose deaths? I'm gonna let you think about it. Well, we actually know two things are happening in the state. First, we know that there is no standardized form or requirement for reporting deaths in the state of Mississippi. I mean, this happens in several rural states where you might have one coroner who reports an overdose death as a respiratory failure and then would never get counted as an overdose death, or someone else might report it as an overdose. So you can see that's part one, there's a disconnect. We need some sort of standardized way to report it. The second piece to that is that we're in small towns. All of these states that we're talking about, small town Mississippi, and it's not uncommon for us to see people attach a stigma to overdose deaths and to know a family and therefore not want to shame, I guess is the right way to say it, the family, and therefore they're going to report it as something other than the overdose death, like a respiratory failure when you actually overdosed. So those are the two problems that we're seeing in our state. So anytime you're looking at numbers for the number of opioid overdose deaths, keep in mind the numbers is probably much higher than what you're seeing. What you're seeing is going to be best case scenario. Okay, this is just the chart that demonstrates the stars that I had on the other page to let you see it in color. However, more telling than this, I think, is this next slide. And in this slide, you'll see that in 2010, for example, in Ohio in 2010, this is where their overdose deaths started, and this is where they ended in 2016. So you can really start to see the increase, and this is showing you down here the numbers are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 per 100,000 people. So you can see how much many of these states have significantly grown. So then the last piece that we're going to kind of talk about here is the different types of opioids that have caused spikes in overdose deaths and kind of how you can begin to see the progression. This slide is a great intro into our next topic, which is how do we get to heroin from opioids? We started our problem around 1999. You can see this green line is the number of prescription opioids. So in 1999, we started prescribing many more opioids than we had customarily done, all the way up until 2010, which is when we started to notice that we had a problem because of this increase in prescription opioids. So our overdose deaths started out as prescription opioids. You can see they just continued to climb. But then if you come down here and you'll notice a very sharp line right here where you start to see the increase in heroin. Remember, I told you we started to pay attention in 2010. So in 2010, when we start to pay attention, prescription opioids become much more difficult to obtain. And you have a population of people who have the problem already. So they've got to get it from somewhere, and heroin was where they turned first. The new one that we're starting to see is happening it started happening around 2013, and it's fentanyl that's causing the next spike in overdose deaths. Now, a lot of that is because heroin is becoming or being laced with fentanyl, but some of it is actual fentanyl use on top of that. This is going to help you understand, this chart will help you understand why prescription drugs matter so much, why the number of prescription drugs we write, and why how we teach our people how to deal with those prescription drugs really begins to matter. So first we see this tall gray line. What we're looking at here is where do non-medical users of opioids get their drugs, okay? And the first one that we see is this very tall line, which is gray, and we notice that that is given to them by a friend or relative for free. Someone's literally just giving them the drugs. The next line is they were prescribed by a physician. The next line, the green, is stolen from a friend or a relative, and then finally the purple is bought from a friend or relative. So if we can control our opioid prescriptions, and we can get people to discard them appropriately, you could do away with all 4 of these major ways people are getting them. Then that just takes their sources down to these few tiny lines that we're seeing down here on the end. We'll talk about that again later, but that's just a little heads up, little segue. And then finally, we look at this, and these are some facts that the CDC reports. This year, they reported that over 2 million Americans aged 12 and up are either abusing or are dependent on prescription opioids in the year 2014. Each day, over 1,000 people are seen in the emergency room as a direct result of prescription opioids that weren't used appropriately. And then the final one that I want to talk about is the connection between these two numbers. I first did this presentation in 2017. And in 2017, the CDC reported that 91 Americans died each day as the result of opioid overdose deaths. That number this year is reported as 115 Americans are dying each day as a result of opioid overdose deaths. With all of that in mind, we go back and look at Webster's epidemic, definition of epidemic, and we see that opioids are affecting a disproportionately large number of individuals within our population, that it is excessively prevalent, and that it is very widespread. That's why we have an epidemic.